everyone. My name is Uzair. I am the Director of Design and Innovation at Mobile Live, and I am so excited for today's discussion. And what we are going to discuss today is really how do we simplify our technology and really make it an enabler and accelerator for digital transformation. So we will cover certain concepts in today's session. One of them is what we keep hearing from our customers uh, is that they have made significant investments into the technology platforms, but they still don't see a lot of progress in terms of speed to market, or they keep hearing that the features that they have requested will be coming next quarter because this quarter we are investing into re-platforming. Um, so that's a challenge that we see across the board. Then there's whole noise and discussion around API transformation and cloud transformation, but the real questions are those transformations delivering onto their promise, onto the business results? So all of this we will try to declutter in today's session. So I'll turn my camera on, and I'll also request our host for today's session, Luca, to join me. And I'll quickly introduce him, and then we'll jump right into the discussion for today's topic. Wonderful. So thank you, Luca. So excited to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So for our audience, I would just quickly introduce Luca again. So Luca is the VP of engineering at CTO.ai. It's a very exciting startup. Do check them out. He has a lot of career years around digital transformation and technology roadmaps. Uh, but I would like to mention that he has masters from MIT in artificial intelligence. He has founded and exited 3 companies in his tenure. He has consulted with a lot of Fortune 500 companies around technology, architecture, digital transformation. Recently, he was a chief architect at one of the largest enterprise in Canada. And amongst the Fortune 500s, one of the prominent ones to name is Uber. He has been associated with their core platform. So excited to have you, Luca. Let's get started by sharing your quick thoughts around this whole conundrum, which we keep hearing. Oh, I'm re-platforming, and you will see the features next month or next quarter. How do you see this?
It's always a journey, right? And that's probably the interesting piece. I think I just take a step back in my academical career, and it brings me back to the concept of entropy, right? And that's probably the interesting piece where you see actually on one side eternal fight between simplification and the fight against time, right? And so that's, I think, what is very, very interesting of this whole journey is this eternal kind of contrast. It will be done tomorrow, but in order to do it tomorrow, we need to build a feature today to enable tomorrow. So you see this exponential kind of level of complexity that is brought um, basically at the table. And that's where I think the major kind of complexity and friction, right, uh, goes and contrast once again the concept of acceleration, right? So I always try to kind of bring back to basic thermodynamics and say it's called digital acceleration, but we are extremely good in putting friction. So how can we accelerate with all this kind of tiny small points of friction, right? And it's mostly where I saw with and I witnessed with my eyes, and I saw in different realities going from large enterprise that wants to be startups that want to be large enterprise, startup that want to stay startup, that they always fight against this concept, right? How can we really accelerate? How can we reduce the cost of experimentation and deliver more value, to the market and to our customers? So I think this is my what I witnessed with my own eyes, and um, is basically almost everywhere.
Yeah, and then this concept of acceleration and friction, like you mentioned, is really interesting, right? And I would like to dig deeper into this bit more. Really, what the technology's goal should be, and what people expect is what they have been sold on. The promise is that investing into the technology platform, re-platforming us, doing the cloud transformation, API transformation is going to enable us to increase our time to market, right?
Yeah.
And as we see in the market, that is becoming really critical because the world we are living in, we talk about agile transformation, design thinking, speed to market. All of those are great, but if the technology cannot deliver it, the roadmap comes to tech team, and the whole thing moves from weeks to months. And that's where the friction, as you said, comes into picture. And unfortunately, technology is becoming the roadblock. So let's dig deeper a little bit and understand what you have seen as common challenges which create the friction in our ability to go to markets quickly.
Yeah. So I love to say that when I look at these situations from a very holistic standpoint, like if I could hover like 10,000 feet up in the sky and look at the situation, I I think actually the main challenge is that once again we are kind of part of an engine, right? That needs to be oiled and smoothened, and needs to be like if you want to compare it to something like a perfect Swiss watch, right? So all these kind of tiny small gears that they together in a perfectly coordinated way keep track of time, right? And it's a very kind of honest also mechanism. And you have different models, right? So without going into too much into watches, but you know what I mean, right? There is a tourbillon versus a zenith movement and others. And I think these are the different kind of realities, right? And so the major frictions to these engines are sometimes the gears themselves. Like you see, for example, I saw several times to have, teams that they were distributed and they could not coordinate pattern and practices, right? So you see basically the eternal discussion, the so-called analysis paralysis, or when basically everything turns into a discussion, into a meeting, instead of being an actionable decision that can be made by a collective, right? Um, the other thing is like the acting as a collective, as a well coordinated collective. That's another kind of challenge, right? And it comes mostly from the silo transformation to this more kind of agile and streamline teams, right? So when you move from doing one thing to have to act with others to build a broader deliverable, right? And definitely this has been from a kind of structural standpoint one of the main kind of friction that I could see. On the other side, I think that is very kind of interesting if you take a deep dive into technology, right? There is the eternal and controversial discussion about data, right? How to access data in a self-serve and democratized way, while at the same time we need to keep compliance going. And then you have the microservice discussion, right? So I'm strongly opinionated on microservices, and I think check in one of my talks, or if you want, we can discuss today about my kind of strong opinion on what microservices didn't really deliver. But the API transformation has been also one of the points of major friction, right? And then you have all the DevOps challenge, right? So, and you mentioned what I'm doing now with CTO.ai, and we are trying to tackle kind of those kind of complexities from a more kind of platform and structure standpoint. And so I think one of the kind of concept that I always loved to bring to everyone's table has always been the transformation from looking at transactions. We are moving in a world where transactions, they're becoming they're taking a different shape. And if you look, for example, how you mentioned one of my past advisory experience with Uber, right? They kind of echoed the concept of transaction to the extreme, I think, with everything is workflow, right? So the concept of workflow kind of took over this kind of new area of integration, this new time of how to build platforms, right? And so everything becomes this nice micro components that can be connected, wired up with other components to build a broader functionality, right? So, and you and I had the fantastic opportunity to chat not so long ago about uh, micro front ends and design-led process, and now those things, they kind of join the fantastic world of digital platforms. And I think that's a little bit the kind of interesting convergence point, where you see that basically everything becomes micro. But at the end of the day, what we want to deliver to our customer are not micro applications anymore, but they need to be into this macro context, right? So because everything is turning in this kind of crazy year into a remote online self-serve, right? We are flipping also the delivery, because there is this incredible high growing demands of um, on one side requirements from our customers, and on the other one is fast and growing fiercest competition, right, for each company to compete against their fiercest competitor, because customers, they only kind of care, if you can use this term, about what they get, right? So I think
Right.
this is a
So
little bit the kind of the picture.
it makes sense. So a lot of interesting concepts and a lot of things. I was noting some of them down, and I would like to dig deeper into a few of them. This concept of macro and micro is a very important one, right? Like you said, we talk about customer centricity and delivering value to the end customer, and we have to bring that viewpoint back in. And somehow the way we have architected our processes earlier, you when we were talking about friction, you mentioned coordination, dependency on other teams, and the siloed structure within the teams, right? I think these are the realities of large enterprise. They want
Yeah.
to work and operate like a startup, but their structure is not, it gets in the way, right? So the concept of macro and micro is really important, because when we, in the Uber example you gave in the similar context, that we had to step back and understand what is it really what we are trying to build, right? Like you said, to what their realization was, it is kind of like a workflow. How do we connect these small modular pieces? One common challenge we see is people either are really good at macro, or they're really good at micro. And the ability to connect these two pieces is really important. Keeping the big picture in mind, and yet breaking it down into smaller components around technology, so that they're highly reusable, right? You often talk about the reusability.
Yeah.
So let's spend some time to understand whose responsibility is this in this technology world to tie in these macro micro concepts, and how do we bridge these gaps of silo and the friction that you highlighted earlier?
Yeah. I mean, probably the time it's great on the East Coast to talk about my favorite image. So one of the things that I kind of saw is that the best example to kind of to answer to this question is the ambition of creating the best in class, and that's what is the drive, right? And so if for a second we kind of change environment and we take a quick journey somewhere else, and we talk about experience, right? And so I've been thinking about this thing for a very long time, because it's partially my passion, and the other one, I think it's a great comparison and a great image for everyone to relate to. And we look at the most extreme experience for everyone, right? Food, right, is a necessity and a pleasure at the same time. We are actually kind of looking at how can we create and deliver a 3 Michelin star experience, because that's the ultimate, right? If you think about food, the 3 Michelin stars is like the top, the perfection, where things are well coordinated, where well blended, right? And you enter into this experience and you like customers joining a website, like customer using a service, right? You enter and you are going there for a service and at the same time for an experience. And so your question, I think, relates perfectly to the idea of the chef de cuisine. So I think that's the responsibility, but not the sole responsibility. And I think it's very important in this kind of transforming um, realities to kind of relate to this picture, right? So in a Michelin star kitchen, uh, prepping is super important, right? So the 5 p.m. service needs to have preparation. And then the kitchen is usually designed in a way to streamline the process from preparation to cooking to plating to calling service, right? And so, the chef only creates two things in this process. And I think looking at workflows is a beautiful concept, right? The chef creates the experience, like this picture. And if you look in technology and try to look at what is the reality nowadays, is the chef is this chief architect, this person that can connect the dots and orchestrate the service, right? So, but it's not his own success only. His success is, and the success of the whole organization are actually coordinated and demand by a collective success. So that's why the concept of the kitchen. There is an assertiveness on the vision, so the so-called disagree and commit model. But at the same time, there is this kind of very important concept that it comes from a collective success, and that's something that I think it's super important, right? It's not about leadership in this case, in this fast transforming world. Requires different kind of set of even skills and visions, right? So I usually kind of use an Italian chef, probably my favorite, Massimo Bottura. Um, Many years, awarded with his restaurant and his crew, right? His crew is super important as best restaurant in the world with Osteria Francescana. And I think it's very important, this picture, because it kind of, it tells a lot, right? He actually kind of challenged the tradition, the Italian tradition, right? Of food with a menu that was called Tradition in Evolution. And you say, wow, but this webinar is not about food. I said, but there's a lot in this picture, right? He challenged the status quo. He looked at the reality and tried to reinvent it with a modern key, with a progressive key, with a demanding key. And he said the time right now is to accelerate for a new tradition, right? Without destroying the current tradition. It's not about disruption. It's about evolution, right? And so that's what I think it's very important, right? In all this story, that sometimes we think about the digital transformation as a disruption, as a revolution, right? And I actually think that we should actually take a step back and look the responsibility of us as technology leaders, as contributors to this fast growing world, right? Can be open source, can be vendor based, but we contribute in one way or another to add one of these reusable blocks, right? So, and going back to your reusable blocks, I think we kind of close this loop, right? Because everything starts with prepping, and prepping is chopping the onion, preparing everything meticulously. That then is going to be assembled in different plates, right? All plates together, they make the menu. It's very important, right? Because what I saw in working, for big telco enterprise, has been the concept of the challenge on how to identify these micro components, right? And everything becomes microservices, right? And then we enter the vortex of microservices, right? Just to reference something close to my past, definitely is a black hole, if I had to kind of compare it to something. Uh, and it's because we forget about the composability of pieces, right? It doesn't mean that working in isolation makes sense for something to stay in isolation. I think the isolation part is mostly to solve what I commonly call, and I'm not taking full credit, because it's something that together with my friend David Mark Clements, we kind of shaped, and so is the logistical complexity, right, from concept to market. And that's where um, logistics are very, very important, right? So I don't want to spend too much time on the kind of Uber example, because it was like a small drop in many situations that I saw. But I think Uber kind of made a statement as a product on the market, right, to demand the new concept of logistics, right? moving things from A to B. They became now a commodity, right? And so um, I think the biggest challenge is how can we commoditize an asset within an organization so that it becomes a click for somebody else. Because microservices, they don't solve this problem. That's a lie. That's a terrible lie that has been told to the industry and everyone, like fish. We got into that bait and in the net, and then got sliced on a plate of somebody else to be eaten, right? That's the fish line example. But I think the real challenge in modularizing and componentizing aspect of an organization to deliver evolutionary business value, it's probably the kind of challenging piece, right? Because
So yeah, so this is the important part. Coming back to modules, right? So the example you gave of a restaurant, and it all boils down to ingredients, and in a way it's a very interesting example, right? Because we are crafting a highly personalized experience for each customer in a Michelin star restaurant, and it's the best of the experiences out there, but it is done in a very high efficiency machine that at the back end all the recipes they're cooking, they would orchestrate them in a way that the ingredients are well prepared. How would you translate this analogy back to the IT world? What does it mean for us to orchestrate, and what does it mean for us to solve the complexity, the logistics of the complexity in terms of the platform? So can you elaborate that, please?
yeah, sure. I think a very practical example on how we can apply this concept is, once again, in the API world, right? One of the major challenges of API transformation has always been discoverability. Once that you uh, take the monolith, right, the so-called monolith, and cut it into pieces, it becomes very kind of complicated to orchestrate discoverability and mostly how do we kind of associate a specific business functionality with a piece of that microservice, for example. So one of the kind of natural evolutions of this path um, is the transformation to the mesh, right? The mesh has been this natural organic growth into kind of democratizing accessibility and discoverability of APIs, right? The other kind of aspect of component of kind of, I don't want to call it layer the monolith, but it means cutting this monolith, slicing it into more digestible pieces, has been the data part, right? So where you remember the famous data lake access to now having the data mesh, right? So there is some sort of pattern, I think, that we are seeing, where things, they organically grow from a monolith to micro components, and then they come back into this kind of distributed monolith that is basically the mesh, because the core complexity is distribution, and it's like in teams, in people. So that's where I think the kind of streamline process of componentizing things is in technology right now. There
So
is
if
not
I
a golden solution.
Right. So if I have to summarize it, the main themes we have touched upon is breaking down things into the modular elements, but it's also equally important to have that experience of putting together those modules for the developers and for the people working in the technology teams. So that's logistical part of it, right?
Correct.
And earlier, I remember we were having a conversation, and the way you described that our journey from monolith to micro components has been that my favorite example that you've used in past is we have sliced the monolith vertically into the microservice architecture, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of becoming like the industry standard everyone is talking about and singing praises of
Yeah.
microservice architecture. Again, not to go deeper into it, but where do you see that it is not still not delivering to the problem? The promise was we're breaking the monolith, splitting it into microservices, which are tied towards our business functions, so that these are components which are reusable. So do you see that is the state of the art?
Um, I mean, no, I think the major problem is that you can slice vertically business functionalities, but technology cannot be cut in a vertical slice. And I give you a very kind of simple example, right? So platforms, like you said in the beginning, they deliver on the promise of self-serve, which means that self-serve, your expectation is that you click a button and something magically happens for you to start building, right? And so one of the major challenges, and that's where I kind of focused in the past years, has been in designing those platforms, right? What is the minimum viable set of functionalities that needs to be equally distributed? So one of the things is that you just mentioned is coordination, right? So we have uh, when we slice microservices in vertical blocks, you create inevitably some discrepancy between different versions, right? Because you start to slice pieces, you distribute pieces horizontally. So coordinating those pieces is pretty complicated, especially when you start looking into modern technologies, or you start looking into a modern way of developing software. And so one thing that I personally saw and fixed in my design has always been there is an initial phase of horizontal slicing and creating all these kind of different layers, right? The foundational layers. Like, so if you think, for example, of a large enterprise system, right? There are the so-called non-functional requirements that are where I saw most of the time people are spending their time. Most of the time the solution has been, oh, but we build a common library, right? But a common library doesn't guarantee for anything, right? It takes actually distance between the determinism that you need to have to lower the cost of the operational cost, they call OPEX cost, and lower the cost and the friction of governance, and have governance some sort of out of the box, right? So you see basically that platforms right now, they become very convoluted because they try to enforce the concept of starter kits. I give you something that you can click, you get everything, and then you slice it, you make changes, and you deploy. But then, everything starts to work on different kind of versions. Version management becomes very complex. So I think the equalizing everything on the same base, that's where you will see everyone will see a huge cut in operational cost. And so um, like a very concrete example in technology has been what Docker brought to these kind of systems together with Kubernetes and other technologies, right? So, but at the same time, you can put whatever you want inside of your Docker container, right? And so, what looks like as a base image becomes sometimes a trap because you don't know what is inside. And so, that's where I think the major complexity of slicing vertically things comes, is that we need to create a foundation for which developers, they focus on delivering on that business value and business capability more than focusing on building one of the, if I can use another example that I think I relate with many people, is that um, the authorization authentication world, right? So every microservice needs to be authenticated and authorized, right? Because we are in this world of clearly personalized experiences, which makes complete sense, right? But at the same time, I can guarantee you that um, there is no way to kind of remove friction on that side. Everyone will implement a library to do authentication, to take the JWT or IDC and convert it into a user identity, and then there are policies, right? So that's where I kind of look at the problem in a different way, and I said, what are the foundational pieces? Now I can distribute this functionality so that the next developer that needs to develop a web service as this functionality is out of the box, right? And he doesn't even have, he or she doesn't even have to care about implementing this functionality because it's out of the box. Is there is governance, right? So we with a high degree of determinism, we know that that functionality is implemented. We have observability, we have transparency, and we have what I call the technological honesty, right? So we can always open this package and know what is inside.
So in a way, in from removing from the microservices layers the identity problem, for example, you mentioned, right? Every team is trying to solve that problem. So we would in the way that you're explaining is finding out those modular blocks and then making the horizontal layers for them, right?
Yeah,
And then the verticals don't have to solve that problem over and over again.
correct.
So how does this concept tie in with the we were earlier talking very briefly, but I want you to spend some time explaining that bit deeper onto the concept of the service mesh, right? And then how do we bring that into the picture and make and achieve this vertical and horizontal layers? How does it look like if you can paint the picture in terms of technology terms?
Yeah, yeah. So the it's probably kind of necessary to kind of start saying that clearly cloud transformation brought a lot of capabilities on the table, right? So the incredible growth of software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service has been a phenomenal catalyst, right, for making all these things a little bit easier. So um, clearly there are different responsibilities, but if you take the service mesh example, right, the service mesh has been key component in the past, let's say, year and a half of platforms and of digital solutions, and especially on large scale architectures, right? So what the mesh brings to the table is the concept of a sidecar, and is a very important concept. So a sidecar basically said, I sit on top of a functionality of a service, right? And I wrap it. And when I wrap it, I also advertise what is inside and say, this service is a user service, is a payment service. And I advertise where this service is. And how I do it as a sidecar, implying the concept of an overlay network. And so what before the cloud created, where it was a traditional network structure, where you have, subnets, VPCs, you have your CIDR blocks and all this kind of, traditional layer 4 kind of terminology. And so everyone was looking in a kind of very kind of flat way at the network, right? And so the mesh kind of flipped it around and said, well, everything has different dimensions, right? You have a VPC, you have some subnets, you have so on and so forth, right? And you go up to basically your application. They say, let's squash them into something called an overlay network, right? So we create a virtual network, and that's the network that services will see. So as soon as you create this thing, you kind of democratize all these services. And so how the service mesh is making this thing simpler, it's creating facades on top of facades on top of facades. And so you start, because thanks to this sidecar, what was introduced was the concept of observability. So one problem less into your service. And so with this pattern, right, you have this sidecar that can start to assume roles, assume functionalities. And so the more you put in the sidecar, the less you're going to put into your application, right? It's obvious. If I have observability in the sidecar and my service is a web service currently, I already kind of equalize observability, policies, zero trust network, and it's all done because this sidecar kind of wraps this application. So
So
I
in
think it's very interesting because like authentication authorization can be now put inside of the sidecar, right? Think about
yeah, yeah.
OPA, and one of the clear examples is using Kuma to do this thing, being the first service mesh, and I think the only that can implement these functionalities. That is, with OPA, I solve the problem of auth authorization, right? So my service doesn't have to, because it's already inside of the concept of the mesh, right? So I think it becomes super elegant because you see the footprint of these services becoming smaller, 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 smaller. So many years ago, I made this very provocative statement during a conference, and I said the future is of functions, and everyone thought about function as a service. And I said, no, no, no. If you think about the workflow on how things that need to be stitched together, everything becomes an input output. Because if you think about an electronic circuit, the basic components are usually the same, right?
Yep.
Transistor, resistance, that, I mean, there are a bunch, but how they are coordinated together, they create new electronic systems. And that's, I think, is the elegancy of this reusability, right? So thinking about these components, because they lower their responsibility, and those kind of macro responsibilities that are equally distributed by this network, your application really becomes a tiny small piece that can be reused.
So in a way, the problem of communication across microservices, right? I think that is significantly solved by the service mesh. And like you said, that the microservice was still large enough, and now we can bring in the horizontal layer through the service mesh
Yeah.
and further componentize it so that it's highly reusable.
Yeah, because it's a transversal. So first of all, communication between services, it's just hiding another complexity. It's communication between people, because there is a cost of ownership and ownership of services, right? So as soon as you make the accessibility to the service easier and cheaper, you start automatically to connect people together, right? And I think that the biggest challenge that I saw is that there is some sort of transversal or cross-cutting uh, challenge with the leadership also, right? So when you see that coordination and also communication becomes a challenge between these silos, is all. I think what I personally saw is that is when technology and when technology kind of is not a tool anymore, it becomes an excuse most of the time, right? So,
Yeah,
and I think that that's where the mesh kind of try to remove some of the friction, say let's solve the communication problem, the security problem, the zero trust, the observability, right? Try to get them out of the box, so that I think it makes easier, right, for that communication to happen.
sounds good. So just checking on the clock, and I want to open the floor for question answers. I'll invite you all to share your questions into the Q&A, and then I'll go over them and ask them, Luca. Um, and anything you want to say on the chat, keep that coming. And while we wait on the questions, Luca, I wanna. So we went deeper into the weeds, right? So we talked about the service mesh, the services, microservices. Let's bring it back, and let me throw you a challenge. So all of this sounds pretty complicated. At least from an investment. Like if I look at from a business perspective, yes, you're telling me all this great stuff that you're going to make further components, which means what? I spend another 6 months building this whole platform before I see more results, right? And like we talked very briefly, touched upon the concept earlier. The whole point of agile is go to market fast, learn from the market, and adapt. But if you're spending too much time, effort, energy into building the platform for future use cases, which may or may not be relevant anymore if we lose the market share. So how do you reconcile this? Like my impression is this thing sounds complicated. So do you have a counter to me that no, this is not complicated and this is how we would simplify it? That's what I'm trying to
um
understand.
Simplification. So Leonardo da Vinci says simplification is the ultimate sophistication, right? So whatever seems simple hides a lot of complexity, and I think that's the problem, right? So bring it back to the original point. um, I think it requires a high degree of understanding the distributed system and how it has to be coordinated in order to remove the time to market. And that's a I think a statement that can be supported by the fact that most of the time we try to simplify things that are very complicated, but because we don't understand the basic of that super complex system, it becomes very hard to simplify. And I think that's where time starts to stretch it, right, and becomes like months. I suggested, so one of the things that I usually implemented in this situation is the kind of 90 days exercise, right? I'm pretty kind of like known for saying everything needs to fit 90 days, but because we need to try to put some sort of boundaries to that, right? And time unfortunately needs boundaries for us to push ourselves to kind of you know confining the problem. But I think the major thing, and I don't want to sound arrogant, is just that it's a very complicated system to solve, right? And everyone thinks, and most of the people think that one size fits all is the way to solve it, or we know how to do it. But the reality is that simplifying the basic level of a platform for a team to scale, it's a very complicated thing. I never seen a product that can solve this problem. Is always a way. I use this example a lot, right? It's like buying a perfect suit, right? You can go and buy an off the rack one, but it will never fit you perfectly, or you can have a bespoke. It's kind of more expensive, right? And so that's why the opportunity is where I think the kind of creative process brings you to commoditize that bespoke experience. So in terms of like my personal experience, right? I don't make it a universal, has been that you always need to observe what are the core problems that you need to solve and start from those problems, right? And the starting points are usually always the same. Is either infrastructure DevOps, front end delivery, APIs, or a lot of governance, right? And you start from there and you start basically iterating fast, right? But you need to know exactly how to surgically cut the problem, or else you're gonna be first time fillet fish, right? It's hard.
So this speaks directly to one of the questions that we just got is around. Interesting. We talked about it in the friction section, which is how do we improve the behavioral side of and the cultural side, because people are used to working in silos. And it's a classic example we see in the API part, right? Somebody built an API, knowing what they knew at that time that the API needs to serve. Now another team needs certain similar functionality. They look at the API, they want to modify it, but the whole team says, "Don't touch my code," because it's going to break whole system apart. So what they end up doing is make a new one, right? Which defeats the whole purpose of having APIs
Yeah.
whatsoever. So I understand what you were explaining earlier is that you need certain level of capability and technical competence at the CTO level and at the chief architect level to be able to simplify these solutions. But how do we deal with these behavioral sides? And how do we stop teams to reinvent and resolve these problems over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, this problem is very interesting, right? So once again, if you were asking me how do you solve it, I would say it's the normal CQRS problem, right? So you need to understand where the complexity of rebuilding functionality is in the right side, is on the read side. And I can tell you that 99% of the time is that you have different experiences that they want to shape data in a different way. And so that's why you end up creating new requirements and building new APIs, right? So one very kind of linear solution here is to redesign your system. So there are a couple of things that I always recommend to people that they want to start innovating. Right, the first one is the strangler. So don't rebuild, strangle. Right, start from the right strangling point and reconnect all these pieces. Right, and to answer to your question about the cultural and behavioral side of, for example, API transformation, I think it all goes back to implementing a strong pattern that the team can implement and they need to implement. And so the typical example on how you use technology to solve this problem, right, is that you can have a GraphQL federation and solve this problem, right? So you have a bunch of entities that they represent, for example, standardized macro models, and then you layer on top an API strategy that allows for the front end to shape requests without having to rebuild a new API, right? And so, like, imagine, let's take a very concrete example. Two teams that they want to access the same model, but they have two different UIs to show, right? And they have two different ways of filtering, two different data sets, right? Because imagine you want to get more data than I want because your UI experience is clearly more complicated, right? So usually what happens is that you build two APIs on top of another API, and then you start to have this matryoshka of APIs. But I think a concrete example in modern times is to use GraphQL, right? GraphQL federation, you federate your models, and you have the consumer to demand the shape of the response that they want to get. So you distribute the logistical complexity on these tiers that they don't have to be rebuilt every single time, right? But they adapt to the consumer, right? Um, And when you write systems, you need to go through a more kind of streamlined model just to connect to, for example, the data question, right? Is you need to think about the system as a pure kind of streamlined container where you dump data in a purely denormalized way, and then you normalize it into a standardized view so that you can then propagate these models, to different API consumers, or in this case, for example, imagine in the modern times of the cloud and serverless, you would basically use systems like DynamoDB, or streamlining to more kind of like traditional SQL storages, but still you want to keep this model as dynamic as possible, right?
Yeah. So folks, keep your questions coming. We still have a few more minutes, and I'm happy to entertain as many as we can take. So we have one more question around that point. So the question is really like, okay, so at some point the technical debt becomes too big, and the whole thing sounds pretty complex. So when do you decide to just burn it all down and restart and reboot?
I mean, calling the so-called rm-rf/ is very, very simple. So destroy everything and restart from scratch, or formatting your hard drive. um I think that's an extreme measure, right? It's basically when I probably only twice in my whole career had to suggest for a complete rebuild, and it's when the solution becomes so convoluted that is impossible to strangle. And most of the time, I can tell you the signals for this thing are mostly related to your identity structure, and basically how you associate user management and data access. There is a certain point where it becomes too complicated, too hard, even to be sure that you're doing the right thing. That is way better to say, let's migrate to something else, right? But I think 98% of the cases, I would say, um, strangle. Strangle allows you to simplify. You put a facade. Remember, the consumer is the most important thing. And so back to the previous question, I think the main challenge is always to define clear interfaces, right? And that's the way you can then strangle in an easier way, because once you have a clear interface, you can strangle, change the producer, and go on and change another piece and another piece.
Yeah. And now here I have two questions which are similar. Well, and they're again tying back to the concept of friction and the team dynamics. Um, so if we are building a distributed uh, modular digital platform, right? What is the organization that we need to have in place? Because again, if there's a huge dimension of people side to it, people are used to working the same ways, we're not going to get the same results. So how do we solve that part? How do we bring in the same ethos of coordination, collaboration, uh, efficiency, and break down the silos? Is that still part of technology domain, or do you think that's more on the business side?
So both, I think, is more on the business side, and technology is a catalyst to accelerate this thing, right? So let me address the technology. Technology set the boundaries and say, this is the rule to build data sets. This is the rule to deploy. This is the rule to this, and that, right? So the more you automate and abstract all those kind of connection points, the more you can focus on the people side. Because you don't want a deployment to be a human process. You want to be some sort of effect of development process that the team is going to coordinate. But in terms of like people, I think the once again, I don't want to use the term mesh too much, but it's always the control plane, right? So you need to have a very strong control plane to coordinate all the different planes, the different teams. And inside of the teams, you need to have a very kind of streamlined structure, I think. Um, I'm kind of I always kind of provocatively say that DevOps create more confusions than clarity for people. And I think I'm gonna kind of stay with my point. I think it's very important to define clear roles, and now people that need to act in a micro collective, which means, if you look at this kind of distributed teams, you have these small tiny teams, And it's very important that roles and responsibility are clearly defined and now people that need to act as a collective. And then it goes back to have a strong leadership that has an understanding of, what the vision is and can actually kind of simplify the week by week delivery to the team. But from a structural standpoint, I saw many, I suggested, I participate to different structures. And I have to say that it's very hard to find a golden solution there because it really depends by the organization, right? But what I saw as a common pattern has been that if the leadership is strong and if it's not and if it's all based on kind of a bottom up set of assertiveness and at the same time respect, it's going to be 10 times easier to coordinate the team because the team is motivated to achieve this vision, right? And the other thing, if I can add a very important point that I experienced so many times, and I feel is probably my best recommendation, is to tell your team to never look backward, because people that are always when you transform and when you see complexity, they always kind of look at past to kind of isolate and self-preserve, right? But it's always kind of important to set the goal, make the goal very achievable, and let everyone focus in that direction, and not try to go back to say, but we did this in the past, right? Because the past is the past, it's there, it's good, but we are focusing on the future, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that is a very important point. And I'll just add to your point around what we see in the market is the change of the organization is a problem that everyone is trying to solve. Like even agile transformations, as we see, the goal is to shift away from the top-down hierarchical model, which was used to be the monolith, right? In
Yeah,
you buying the analogy from you and using it there, the way things need to work is like the distributed architecture of the technology platform. Organizations also need to be more and more distributed, where there's modular approaches and modular functions where people are coming together. But like you said, there is a strong, well coordination on top to make it all work. So it's
yeah.
not a central command and control. It's more like, so these things that I think in my opinion, like they go hand in hand. Your culture needs to be adopting towards this, which is collaborative, working with each other, defining the clear roles and responsibilities, and that reflects in your architecture as well.
Yeah, and there is a very important point, right? So we started with the logistical complexity, and I think it comes from an engineering first mindset, where we look at technology as the once again, it's some sort of armor, right? It's like the moat around your castle, right? But I think in this new economy, in this new world, um, uh, having a customer driven approach where we focus more on these two variables, that is fast time to the market, because our customers, they are demanding more and more and more. It should be the core, right? And so in order to have this thing achievable, you need to create on one side a flatter structure, right, in your organization. You need to equalize, but on the other side, you need to have a very strong leadership, right? Because a fully flat structure will never work. A fully hierarchical will create a lot of friction and slow down, because there are many steps to climb the ladder. But if you kind of flatten the probably engineering side, and create a stronger technology leadership that is clearly led by the C levels in a more very progressive way, I think you're going to create a lot of speed. But once again, too flat doesn't work, too hierarchical doesn't work. It's always like in media stat virtus, the Latin side, right? So the truth lies in the middle, and I
Yeah,
think that's exactly the truth.
sounds good. So I think we are very close to our end. So last question is a very interesting one. If I'm a chief digital officer and I'm trying to take my organization forward and really establish digital as the core driver of business, whatever industry, telco, commerce, logistics, right? What would be your message to me? What should I demand from my technology teams?
Um, it's to that's a very interesting question. I think my message, my recommendation as an advisor would be, um, don't be fooled by technology. Try to coordinate what are the core values. Like, try to define what are the three core edges of your success in terms of like organizationally. And definitely the recommendation to a CIO is to try to broaden also the kind of view on the future technology, and not just like be fooled by one size fits all, nor by the the pre-made meal, because there is a lot of kind of hidden, there are many hidden costs in that, right? So what I usually recommend to C levels in my consultancy journey, I always advise C levels to have a very strong advisory board, a group of people that are external to the organization and can help looking at the problem from that different point of view. Because most of the time there are agendas that they conflict and they create fictional realities. And is it was not to kind of promote more consultancy, but advisory. I think that's would be probably my peak. My first recommendation is be advised by somebody that understand the technology industry and can advise on what the next step should be.
Sounds good. Perfect. All right. So we are almost on time. What I would like our audience to do is also write down if they would be interested in any further topics for us to go further in detail. So we would be happy to host Luca and dig deeper into those subtopics. Um, so if you can just share them in the chat or send us an email and share your opinions on if you would like us to explore more microservice architecture, service mesh, uh, digital platforms. What aspects of them would you like us to dig deeper into?
I would be more than happy to deep dive in any of those.
Sounds good. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Luca. It was a
Thanks,
fun
Uzair.
discussion and hope to have many more.
Looking forward. Goodbye, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much.